Hey, so you can tell we're recording now. I got to back up a little bit. We've been looking at this this period of time. Remember, what we're doing. We're looking at the Jewish holidays, and this is such a great, the festival days. This is such a great review of the festival days that are so important to Judaism, and all of the ones that we've looked at have been established and were established in Scripture, in the Hebrew Bible, as we know it. So Passover, we can read that story, and Shavuot, we can read the story of Rosh Hashanah, we can read the story of Yom Kippur, and we've been looking at that. And Sukkot, all of these things are established in the books of Moses. But after Sukkot, that 8-day period of feasting and enjoying the abundance of the land, there is about a 6 to 10 week period that still requires some sort of liturgical reflection. And according to Spong's thesis here, what the book of Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew, is a reflection on the Jewish liturgy as seen through the new messianic profession, or the new profession of Jesus as the Messiah. So Jews trying to understand the person they're claiming to be the Messiah, Jesus, in the midst or in the context of their faith. And Spong is very clear on the fact that, when it comes to Judaism, everything is about, well, I shouldn't have put it that way, but Jews, their stories are symbolic. They use metaphor. Their linear thinking and what we might call, rational type of thinking that emphasizes logic is not as important as what we might call a more symbolic way of thinking. And so Spong is trying to really encourage us to read these stories and note the symbolism. Unfortunately, what happened when the Gentiles came to take prominence in the church around 150, their Greek-informed philosophical approach to reading texts, 400 years of Greek or more of Greek philosophy preceding them, led them to read these texts as literal stories. And so the main thesis that Spong wants to talk about here, and frankly, I'm not so sure that the title of this book is the best title, because sure, he's talking about biblical literalism, but there's so much more that we're looking at here. But the thread that does run throughout all these chapters is that, look, when Matthew was writing his gospel, he didn't expect these stories to be taken literally. They are highly symbolic, and they are usually reflective of some sort of story that is going to tie Jesus to the messianic hopes that are present in the Hebrew Bible. Jesus and Elijah, for example. And we just got finished last time, or the time before that, looking at how John the Baptist is fashioned in this new liturgy as the Elijah who is proclaiming and professing the coming of the Messiah, who's Jesus. And now we're looking at this period of time that is broken up into 3 sections. The first of those sections dealt with the emphasis on John the Baptist as the predecessor, the harbinger, the one proclaiming Jesus coming. And then there are 2 characters, one of those being the Canaanite woman, and the other being Peter. Now, I don't know about you, but when I was finishing up reading chapter 23, I really thought the emphasis on Peter was a little slim. It just ended rather quickly. So we'll get a chance to talk about that. Are there any questions before I get started, or any comments? Well, we're moving towards the Feast of Dedication, the dedication of the temple. And this will be the first Jewish holiday, the first Jewish feast day that is not established in the Old Testament, but it's what we would call a rabbinic feast day. And I'll give you a little bit of insight into that. But the characters that we're looking at now, in the 6 to 10 week period of time between Sukkot and the Festival of Dedication, roughly between mid-October to mid-December, the emphasis is on universalism, which has been an emphasis throughout, but that truly, at least with respect to this one character we're going to be looking at, the Canaanite woman, there's a challenge being made to people who are listening to these stories. How far will God's love go? How inclusive must we be? And this is a place where I think Spong really tries to emphasize, yes, this was important for the first century Jewish Christians who are listening to it, but how all the more important it is for us too, you know? If Jesus is a Messiah who's going to open the doors of the synagogue, so to speak, so that the Gentiles might also experience and be part of God's love and care, how far does that inclusiveness go? And, you know, just to kind of tip my hand a little bit, Spong is going to say it goes a long way. And there's no better emphasis for this, or there's no better example of this than to read the story of the Canaanite woman. And so I'm going to read that. Remember where we've come from. In chapter 14, Jesus feeds the 5,000, but he also feeds the 4,000. And this is the symbolic inference here, is that, you know, Jesus is the new Moses for the Jewish people, providing manna from heaven in the desert. But guess what? He's going to feed 4,000, and that represents the Gentile nations as well. And in between this, there's a story about Peter walking on water, and I'll come back to that. But now that we move into chapter 15 and into chapter 16, there's a really interesting story here. And I have to say, I think I mentioned this last time, that this one really, it has always confused me, because the Jesus that I hear in this doesn't appear to be that universal, doesn't appear even to be that nice a guy. So let's read it. And I remember I kind of confused my youth group leader when I was a kid, because I had read this story, you know, having read Matthew, and said, well, what about Jesus turning away this woman, saying he didn't come for her salvation? And it has always been a story that has confounded me, really. And here I'm reading from chapter 15, verses 21 through 28. Jesus left that place where he was praying, and where he had just fed the 4,000, I'm sorry. Jesus left that place and went away to the district of Tyre and Sidon. Let me stop and give you just a little annotation here. Never overlook the geography and the geographical references in the New Testament. It's important, you know, Matthew wanted to put them in there. You know, if I just wanted to talk about Jesus in some sort of abstract way, I could do it. But when I say Jesus went over to, you know, Grand Island, or, you know, these are markers that tell us, oh, I know what Grand Island is like. Well, when we see the words Tyre and Sidon, they're code, really, for and they go all the way back to the time of Elijah. This is the area in the desert outside of Tyre and Sidon where Elijah was. There was a woman there by the name of the woman of Zarephath, or the widow of Zarephath, and she was a Gentile. And so here Elijah was, you know, living in communion with a Gentile, and, you know, serving her needs as well as, you know, as he would the needs of the Hebrew people at the time. So we're looking at Jesus going to Tyre and Sidon. So this immediately, if you're a Jew sitting in the synagogue, should clue you in, hey, Jesus is going to Gentile territory now, which makes sense. He just fed 4,000 Gentiles, right? He left that place and went to the district of Tyre and Sidon. Just then, a Canaanite woman from that region came out and started shouting, "Have mercy on me, Lord, son of David. My daughter is tormented by a demon." But he did not answer her at all. And his disciples came and urged him, saying, "Send her away, for she keeps shouting after us." He answered, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." But she came and knelt before him, saying, "Lord, help me." He answered, "It is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." She said, "Yes, Lord, yet even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table." Then Jesus answered her, "Woman, great is your faith. Let it be done for you as you wish." And her daughter was healed instantly. So let me just stop there before we talk about what Spong says. How do you respond? What are your thoughts when you hear that story? Anybody? Go ahead, Will. You're muted, Will. Please unmute. Will, you're still muted. I can see you're talking, but all right. Apparently you don't want to talk. All right. Okay. Anybody want to jump in? Well, there's Laura. Okay.
Good. It seems pretty heartless at first.
Yes.
And exclusive.
Yeah, very much so. Very much so. Welcome, Laura, by the way. Yeah, very exclusive, especially on the heels of what we've just witnessed, right? Jesus feeds 4,000 people, Gentiles, if the symbolism of the story, as Spong points out, is correct. And so just the inconsistency leads me to, especially in this context that Spong is talking about, leads me to think that this is kind of an object lesson, not to be reflective of the Jesus of history, right? But to be reflective of the transition that the Jews who follow Jesus and proclaim him as the Messiah, the transition that they must be going through. Almost as if to say, look, if this is the transformation that the Jewish Messiah can make, a realization that helps him to step outside of his, circle of comfort, you might say, then doesn't this represent what we as followers of Jesus, the church, so to speak, need to be doing as well? Jesus really here represents the standard reference or the standard response that people would make to this woman. And there are clues in this that demonstrate that Matthew wants to make this woman's presence all the more heinous, you might say, all the more disagreeable than a similar story that's found in Mark. Now, you might remember that when Matthew wrote his gospel, he used Mark as a source. And the story in Mark is a little bit different. When we read it in Mark, the woman is not a Canaanite, but she's a Syro-Phoenician woman. Tyre and Sidon is where, is in the Syro-Phoenician desert on the coast. And someone who's Syro-Phoenician is a little bit more acceptable, a little bit more cultured, has at least some virtues that can be recognized by any rational person, right? There's good references to Syro-Phoenicia well, I shouldn't say that because that's where Jezebel came from. But in Jesus' time, a Syro-Phoenician woman was not looked upon as harshly as a woman who would be a Canaanite. A Canaanite is almost it can be used as a derogatory term. And if you know the history of the Hebrew Bible, as those who would be listening to this story would, remember, we're talking about Jews in a synagogue hearing the story of Jesus and reading it through the lens of their Hebrew Bible and the references made in the Hebrew Bible. The Canaanite woman would be seen as, well, roughly the same as a Samaritan woman. Nothing good about them, certainly living on the other side of the tracks, having no morally redeeming qualities or virtues. And that has its history that goes all the way back to the time of well, Abraham and Genesis, but certainly in the time of Joshua. Remember when the Israelites came into the land flowing with milk and honey, the people that they had to displace from the land were Canaanites, and they didn't fully displace them. The Canaanites were the ones who worshiped Baal and Asherah and had all these agricultural rituals and festivals that were constantly, tempting the Israelites away from the true worship of God, what they believed to be the true worship of God. So Canaanite represents the liminal, the other who's beyond, the pale of your community, the one you don't want to be around. And add to that the gender dynamics here, right? It's a woman. It's pretty clear that Matthew, whenever he uses women as an object lesson, there's usually going to be something tainted about them that enters into the picture. You might remember when we looked at the genealogy of Jesus in Matthew, there were 4 women mentioned, and not a single one of them was a virtuous, upright, upstanding woman. They were usually, connected with some sort of, sexual subterfuge, like Ruth, So the case is the same here with the Canaanite woman. So, but nevertheless, here's this woman who would ostensibly be seen as having no moral virtues whatsoever, but there's one virtue that's hard to get rid of, and that is the virtue of being a loving mother. I mean, there's hardly anything more reprehensible than a mother who does not care for her children, right? A mother who's neglectful. At least this Canaanite woman, who, despite all of her other, shortcomings, nevertheless is a loving mother. A loving mother who is beside herself because of her daughter's, illness. Her daughter's been possessed by a demon. And she's got to be at her wit's end, right? Think about all the people who, are taking these alternative COVID medicines. Like some of them are doing it because, they have no other choice. My gosh, nothing's working. I got to try some. This Canaanite woman goes to the lengths of saying, I'm going to go to the Jewish Messiah and see what he can do about it, right? It's not like that was her first choice, we can be assured. So we see cultures coming together here, and the first instinct is, and it's not the instinct from the Canaanite woman. The first instinct is from Jesus to say, hey, look, you're not part of the clan. You're not part of the group. I didn't come for your type. But she persisted. And in the end, Jesus himself is transformed, which is really hard for us to imagine because, hey, this is supposed to be the Son of God, perfect, all that kind of stuff. That's not what Matthew wanted to put across here. This is Jesus who was a product of the culture of the very people who were hearing this story. They could relate. And they would probably say, well, gee, of course, that's what Jesus should be saying, right? But he's transformed in the midst of this. And responds to this woman, great is your faith, which opens the door. There is a watershed moment here. So let me stop and see if if my rambling on has led you to the point of boredom or confusion or anything like that. Will, you're unmuted. You were trying to say something before.
Oh, I'm really sorry to distract. I somehow managed to lose the screen with your slides.
Oh, well.
Well, after 10 minutes, I finally got it back. So I'm sorry. I was just trying to tell you to let me back in, but obviously you were seeing me. So I was in.
Yeah.
I just had my screen. So sorry about that. Sorry about
well, the screen you should be looking at is a 14th century, and I think this is an image from a prayer book. You can tell the Canaanite woman, with her head covered, which is interesting there. Jesus with his disciples over her, turning his back on her. And of course, the other part of the story, the way that these medieval artists usually worked is the whole story was told in one particular scene, right? Here's the young girl over here dressed in blue, which is the symbol of purity and virginity even. And innocent in all of this. And so the scandal of it all, Jesus turning his back not only on the woman in red, because we know what red stands for, right? But the child in blue. Oh my goodness. But of course the story doesn't end up that way. Other comments about that or questions?
Dan?
Yeah, please.
You mentioned geography, but I was thinking too that when somebody lives somewhere else, they also have a tendency to have a belief system that's much different. Yeah. And one of the things that I've picked up along the last few years is the tendency for other cultures to believe in multiple gods. And this was an angle toward singular. And that really did mean that the folks who felt chosen, if I can use that word, wanted to bring those away from other gods, certainly plural ones, to them. Is that part of that supplication? Oh, yeah, absolutely. Remember, the Canaanites, her descendants would have been the worshipers of Baal and Asherah and Mot. Mot was a god that required child sacrifices. So you can imagine just how abhorrent this was to the Jews. But by this time, as we know in the letters of Paul, Jews would have recognized that there were no other gods. Even when we read in the Old Testament, Israelites who were living in the land of Canaan, they were really called henotheists. They weren't monotheists. Henotheism means that you worship one God and one God alone, but you recognize that there are other gods out there. I mean, this is clear when we read the 10 Commandments, right? Because God himself says, you shall have no other gods before me, acknowledging that there are other gods out there, right? That would have been the context in which that was written. But over a period of about 700 years or so, the movement is towards strict monotheism. There is one God and no other. Everything else is clamoring after idols, and idols that are little more than wood or stone, and have absolutely no connection with any real transcendent reality. So that being the case, it's not so much it's that you're removing this person from a belief system that is legitimate, because as Paul says, this isn't legitimate. These are just rock and stone. What you're doing, and the only thing that you can do in a monotheistic tradition, is one of two things. You can either invite people in and affirm that the God who created all of creation created the people that you're inviting in, and God must love them as well, which is what is wanting to be emphasized here. Or you can do the thing that's logically contradictory and say,
God is a God of love who created all of creation, but he only loves us. Which one is the one we see most often today, unfortunately, and people living in contradiction. But this woman in her humility, says, yeah, I recognize that you're the Jewish Messiah, but and Jesus calls her, at this time, the Gentiles were often referred to as dogs, and dogs are not, nice little things that you pet on your lap, or, that wag their tail like crazy when you come home. Dogs are, kind of nasty animals. They're dirty, so to call somebody a dog is, those are fighting words. And Jesus says, I did not come to, how did it go? I better read it again, because I don't want to, and he answered, I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. But she came back and knelt before him and said, Lord, help me. It is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs. She said, yes, Lord, yet even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table. Persistent here, right? Persistent, but in a wise way, because it's and of course Jesus is transformed in this. This is all about universalism. This is hitting people hard in the face. Maybe I don't like that use of that. This is causing people, Jewish people in the synagogue who believe in Jesus the Messiah, to really recognize what they believe. Hey, if you believe Jesus is the Messiah, the thing that is also going to come along with that necessarily is this idea of universalism, because it goes back to that logical problem that we just established. If there is only one God, and that God is a God of love who created the world, and that God sustains the world, it does not make sense that God would only want to sustain and love and look out after one people. And this is the transition. This is the major transition that's going to take place within the Jewish tradition. No longer is exclusivism going to represent who we are as a people. We are going to be, like Paul tried to emphasize, we are going to be a people who open the doors of the synagogue to the dogs. Though I don't think we're going to call them dogs anymore here. Anyway, any other thoughts on this? Because Spong has some wonderful things to say about this as an object lesson.
And
yeah,
this isn't maybe quite to your point, but I need an art history sentence or two. Why the artists, I mean, it looks like they're in the foothills of the Alps or the Pyrenees.
Yeah. Well, remember, it's Tyre and Sidon too.
Yeah.
Right. And that's where the cedars of Lebanon came from.
Yeah.
So it would have been hilly.
So green and lush. And I guess they're trying to relate to their audience.
No, that's exactly right. I mean, that's what all art, artists throughout the ages did, is that they would look at Caravaggio. I mean, he in the early 17th century, he was painting Jesus in 17th century garb and Jesus' disciples, and the context was always something that people could relate to, which I think is a great technique, because if you put Jesus in garb that we don't recognize, it makes it one step removed from our reality. So this is what artists, Rembrandt did the same thing, always, the Flemish peasant that was peering out of the darkness of of his paintings. So anybody else, anything else?
I guess I'd just add, it seems to me that what Spong is pointing out here is that Jesus is basically attacking the concept that still is around big time of thinking of other people as infidels. Now, that's
Right.
not a term that's used a lot in Christianity, but it's still used, I believe, in Judaism, and obviously we heard a lot of it in connection with Muslims.
Mhm.
But he's saying the same thing, and it hasn't gone away. I remember, I'm old enough to remember a member of the Jewish parliament back when I was probably college age, an Israeli radical guy named Meir Kahane, if
Mhm.
anybody remembers that name, and he was eventually assassinated. But it was because he referred to the Palestinians as dogs.
Ah,
And that carried a tremendous insult to the Palestinians, obviously.
right.
And it was a scandal in Israel that somebody that extreme would be in a position of power. And as I say, he
Mhm.
eventually was assassinated, I believe. But, it still exists, whether you're, Catholic or Protestant or whatever, there's still
Yeah.
that tendency to exclude and declare the people that don't agree with you as the great other.
Right.
And
Right.
to me, Jesus is trying to, and he does it by basically having a story in there that Matthew inserts, where he starts off that way and then kind of almost recognizes the error of his ways based on her argument to him, and
Right.
says, no, there are no infidels.
Yeah.
And I think that's what Matthew's really trying to promote here.
Mm-hmm. And the very next slide, Mac, just feeds right into that, because I took it out of this quote out of 2 pages, but I tried to narrow it down. But this is Spong's take on this, on what the Canaanite woman represents, and the lesson we can take from it. The Canaanite woman has assumed many forms throughout Christian history. She's been the Jews, scorned, hated, and persecuted. She has also been the Muslims, called infidels during the church-inspired crusades of the 11th, 12th, and 13th centuries. She's been the Africans, kidnapped, transported to a new world, and sold into slavery. She's also present among those members of the gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender community. The Canaanite woman is therefore not a person of history, there's our theme coming through, but an eternal symbol, always standing before the human conscience, challenging its limits, demanding to be heard. And she will, and I like that, demanding to be heard, the other demanding to be heard. And she will not go away until she's embraced. Her face will change throughout history, but her demands will remain constantly challenging our security and eroding our barriers. And that's the tough part of this messianic movement, Yeah, you want to be a part of it. Please be sure what you're taking on. And that's what the next story of Peter is all about, that I think that Spong does not treat as elaborately as he could. But I love this. I just had to write this quote down because, well, when I was reading it, I usually write all over my books. And so I wanted to quote the whole page of pages 253 all the way down to the middle of 254. Well, I wasn't going to do that. But Spong's point is your point, Mac, and vice versa, that, we place a lot of women in the images in our stained glass in churches, right? And usually it's Mary or Mary Magdalene. Sometimes you'll see the woman at the well. But the Canaanite woman is the one that is constantly calling us back to what we say we believe. We've been unable to maintain this inclusiveness throughout the history of the church. In fact, I would say that the one thing that makes us human is our that makes us unfortunately human is our tendency to define ourselves not in terms of who we are, but in terms of who we're not. And what do you end up with, right? If you're constantly saying, I'm not that, or I'm not that, and I'm not that, I'm not that, what's left but just a negation of everybody else? And what an entirely negative way to live. You end up being nothing instead of being something. This is who I am. This is what I believe. The Canaanite woman challenges me, but not in such a way that I'm going to exclude her, but I'm going to embrace her as a symbol of the other that is not a threat, of the other that is not one to be excluded from my identity. I can embrace otherness. And there's a great Jewish philosopher of the 20th century. His name is Martin Buber. He wrote a book called I and Thou. And he says the place where we're the most human is in that challenge that comes from looking another person in the eye. And I mean, this is where the encounter takes place, that eye-to-eye relationship, where I am who I am by virtue of my relationship with you. I am an I, thou, right? I can't be someone by excluding the thou, right? I can't say I don't want to be with you, because you end up being in utter individual, which ironically is where we are in our country, right? Individuality is where everything falls. But that's not what the Christian doctrine or Christian theology, and certainly the story, has to say. We are who we are by virtue of our relationships. And those relationships even include those that we don't often sometimes want to include. But if you're going to be part of this new Messianic community, guess what? You are the Canaanite woman. The Canaanite woman is you. And embrace that. So that's why I just had to write, especially, I think the Canaanite woman for many people today are those who are racially excluded, ethnically excluded, but also those who, by virtue of their gender roles, of their sexuality, the gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, queer community. I don't understand what the threat is, but it certainly is there, to the point that people want to legally as well as morally exclude them. So any further thoughts?
Just
Go ahead, Matt.
one last point. I can see why you wanted to quote that entire thing.
Yeah.
But his last sentence before he switches over to Peter, you could probably have about a 3-hour seminar on, where he says, perhaps we need to confront the possibility that Christianity has not failed, as our critics constantly assert. The reality, I believe, is that Christianity has never been understood, and thus has never really been tried. That's a mouthful, and I'm not sure that very many people would agree with that, but
yeah, well,
Spong is something. He is something.
That's what this book is about, right? It's just like, hey, try to understand Christianity in its original context and in the original religious ethnic context out of which it came, and also understand what we lost when that gentrification, might we say, the Gentileization of Christianity took over. This movement of inclusiveness that lasted for maybe 100 years turned around and became exclusive once again. So by the time we get to Constantine and all of the confessions of the church, guess what? We're defining ourselves over against who we're not again. Actually, that's a little too harsh. The confessions are meant to define ourselves by virtue of what we believe, but in so doing, they also negate those who might challenge a different view of who Jesus is. So any other thoughts on this? I want to continue to look to Joyce and Galen, because, you know, in terms of geographical outsiders, there are Canaanite women.
Yeah. The point that really got to me was when he says, I'm just going to paraphrase, but rather than deal with the social problems that slavery and segregation created, that basically what we want to do out of sight, out of mind. And that one just, I don't know that, because we see that all the time, right? If we don't see it, it doesn't exist.
Oh boy, you're right. I mean, gosh, I was just thinking about this. Well, for example, I was thinking of the wildfires. We don't often, the wildfires that we're having all over the place, but think of sure, humans are being displaced, but think about the ecosystem that is, we don't even, that doesn't even enter our consciousness, right? All of the little toads, all of the deer, the rabbits, and all of the landscape, some of which will thrive over time because of the fire. But I think of that displacement, and I don't know, maybe it's a self-preservation mechanism that we have, that we just have to shut that out. But yeah. I do think you're right that we don't want to see what's around us.
I think that's it. When you just said about fires, because we had, where I live, the second largest fire back in 2020. And, 346 local people lost their homes. And there's still people that are fighting with their insurance, but it's kind of, it's like out of sight now. It's just, that was in the forefront for so long.
Yeah. Well, it was a different news cycle, right?
Yeah.
And we chained ourselves to the television, watched it until it became uninteresting, and then we moved on to the next catastrophe. And there's something there is that doesn't love a catastrophe, as I think Robert Frost said that. No, just kidding. Anybody else before I move on to talk about good old Peter, the rock? I can't help but think that Jesus was being ironic when he was making that statement. Peter, you're the rock on which I will build my church. Peter was the furthest thing from a rock. I mean, that guy was a sandbar by any definition, not something I'd want to build a house on. But yeah, let's move on, because there is the story, and Spong, we're still in chapter 23, and Spong really doesn't do much but a couple of comments on Peter. But maybe he's going to pick it up later. I'm not sure. But there was a story in between. There is something I do want to focus on here. When Jesus feeds the 5,000, and then he feeds the 4,000, there is a separation, a interlude, we might say, where he goes out and he prays, and the disciples go off in a boat on the Sea of Galilee. And by about 3 o'clock in the morning, Jesus says, "Yeah, I'm all set. I'm finished praying. I'm going to go out and get back in the boat with the disciples." And so he walks across the water. Now, again, Spong says we can't take this literally. Nothing in our experience ever says that there is, in defiance of the law of gravity, that there's ever a human being that was able to walk on water. So what is the importance here? Well, the emphasis on water is another one of these Moses stories, because remember what Moses does. He parts the Red Sea. He has authority over creation in that respect. And upon reading the story of Jesus walking on the water, and all the other water stories, by the way, where Jesus has them cast their nets over the boat, it is another image of Moses. Here is the new Moses. Jesus, as Moses had control and authority, I should say, over over creation, by the hand of God, so does Jesus over this. Now, there's something in this that seems a little bit out of place, but they're close enough to each other where you note the irony. In Matthew 16, the walking on the water story happens in Matthew 14, I believe, or 15, somewhere around there. But there's a place, and it comes right smack dab in the middle, as my grandmother's term, smack dab, right in the middle of the gospel itself, almost as if it's the hinge, the fulcrum on which the gospel balances. And Jesus is talking to Peter, and he says, who are people saying that I am? I mean, well, some people are saying you're Elijah, some people are, one of the great prophets. And then Jesus says, well, who do you say that I am? And Peter responds, you are the Christ, you are the Messiah. And Jesus responds by saying, it's not out of human intellect that you've said this, but by the Spirit of God. And on you, Peter, I shall build my church, the ecclesia. This is the only time in the Gospels that the word church is referred to. And church is a very Greek word. I mean, you find it throughout Paul, right? Church isn't exactly a Hebrew word. So most likely this statement on Peter's part was something that was placed, knowing Matthew's gospel and its Jewish heritage and its Jewish orientation. Most likely this was a later addition in the mouth of Peter. But there's some irony in this as well, because we've just seen that though Peter can make his confession, he can make his confession in word, but when it comes to being able to demonstrate that indeed, he falls a little bit short, literally falls into the water itself. Peter's doubt keeps him from following the Messiah in as faithful a manner as he could. And this is how Spong concludes. Peter could say the words, but he could not live the message. That same pattern of behavior would also plague the church through the centuries. The call to universalism has long been countered by our inability to live that message out. Call to universalism. I think if we were to ask people on a Sunday morning about universalism, we would not get a very positive response. Not at all. But Spong makes it pretty clear here. And I think I've mentioned enough that I really like the fact that that Mac introduced this book to us. It's really helping me see the Gospels in a new way. And this emphasis on inclusiveness and universalism all the more. Now, is it something that we can, do of our own volition? Is it something that we are naturally prone to do? No. Whether you look at yourself biologically, culturally, or whatever, everything focuses on the idea that I should be the one who is at the center of the world, right? I should be the one that around which all things revolve. I mean, from the moment you are born, the first moment you take a breath, if your mother cares for you, you can't help but think that you are it, right? Hey, look, you go for 2 years utterly dependent upon this greater being. And then you come to realize, oh, maybe in your 3rd year, when you have a little brother, a little sister or something, oh, wow, there are other people out here, and mom cares for them too. And then you spend the rest of your life unlearning what you naturally took on, the first 2 years of your life: selfishness, self-centeredness. And as an institution, I'm not so sure the church is able to do this, but my goodness, if we don't try, I don't know where we're going to end up. So that's kind of my last word as we conclude this part 6 of this book and move on to the emphasis on the Feast of Dedication, which is known as Hanukkah. Please jump in if anyone would like to say anything, if you're thinking anything along these lines. Okay, we don't have but a few minutes, but we are going next time to move into part 7 of the book. And the story of Jesus' transfiguration, which happens, frankly, right after, Peter's confession, where Jesus takes Peter, James, and John up to the top of the mountain, and there he is transfigured. He's bathed in white light. and at his side are Elijah and Moses. And, of course, the disciples are utterly blinded and traumatized by the experience. And Peter says, hey, let's stay here. This is great. We're living in the heavenly reality right here. And Jesus says, no, we still have some work to do. But the experience of transfiguration is incredibly central to the gospel in this case. By the way, the transfiguration doesn't occur in the Gospel of John, which is really interesting. But it does occur in the three gospels, the synoptics. Now I'm doubting myself. We'll have to check that. I think that's the case, though. But in the week that we have between now and next week, try to think of Jesus and the body of Christ as taking the place of the temple. What is the temple but that place where you experience the presence of God, where God makes known God's care and concern for the world, as we saw in the Yom Kippur service. With the coming of Jesus, the temple is no longer necessary because Jesus is the temple. Jesus is the place where God becomes incarnate, the presence of God. Jesus is the place where God's love for the world can be demonstrated. So it's a really interesting juxtaposition. Think of everything that the temple stood for the Jews, the Israelites and the Jews for 1,000 years, from David all the way till its destruction in 70 of the Common Era. And now with the writing of Matthew, very shortly after that, the destruction of the temple, with the writing of Matthew, we have a new temple that's introduced. And Matthew is going to emphasize that in his, in the next chapter that we read. Sorry, my phone just rang, and people are going to want to be calling me after lunch here. So any last words before we go?
Thank you. This was really a good chapter. Interesting.
Yeah. Thanks, Gayleen. I'm glad you enjoyed it. And Laura, we're glad you could join us as well. Are you in Hastings?
Yes, I'm in the basement of Constance's house. Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure to learn.
For those of you who probably don't know, Laura is Constance and Harvey's new daughter-in-law. Can I say new daughter-in-law? Relatively new. Yeah. So, and a lovely person. Okay. Well, we'll see you all next time. I'm going to stop sharing. And
thank you, Dan.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Let's have some fun next week. See you later.
Bye-bye.
Bye.